Hello, I'm Ernesto, a driver for a moving company that travels weekly on Highway 150D from Puebla to Orizaba. I've been on the road for 12 years, and I've always said that a diesel engine beats louder than my own heart. Driving at night has never been difficult for me. The thumping of the tires, the constant roar underfoot, and the darkness that envelops everything with an almost religious silence give me peace. But what I experienced a couple of months ago changed the way I look at every mirror and every curve. That early morning, I was returning to Orizaba with a load of furniture and belongings. Around 1 a.m., I stopped at the Tajacote, a small restaurant attached to the shoulder where the coffee is served watery but boiling hot, while the owner refilled my cup. A crane mechanic with a grease-soaked shirt sat down next to me and asked the classic question, "Are you going to pass by kilometer 242? Yes, Decorrido, I answered without thinking. He let out a dry laugh and lowered his voice. Well, watch out for the child without a reflex. The locals say he appears right around the bend of the old bridge. If you see him and don't stop, your trailer will lose its brakes." I made an incredulous gesture. You hear so many stories that you learn to smile without getting caught up in them. However, something in the mechanic's gaze gave me an uneasy tingle. I paid, thanked him, and resumed my journey. Shortly after merging onto the highway, I spotted a lump on the side of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It was a young man in his 20s, wearing a small backpack and a light-colored jacket, timidly waving his hand. The drizzle was beginning to wet the windshield, and the clock read almost 2. "I braked on Leonardo," he said as he got on. "My motorcycle broke down. I just need to get to the Maltrata junction." His voice sounded shaky, but more from the cold night than from fear. I offered him coffee from a thermos. He accepted and took a long sip. We chatted about road music, fuel inflation, and silly things to stave off drowsiness. As we passed kilometer 240, the air inside the cabin suddenly chilled. The defroster couldn't keep up. Leo hugged his chest. "It's always so cold here," he asked. Before answering, I saw a tiny silhouette in the rearview mirror next to the passenger seat, a boy in dark overalls and a white shirt, barely illuminated by the green panel on the dashboard. I couldn't see his face. I blinked, and the image dissipated like smoke. I preferred to remain silent. I thought it had been a reflection from the taillights of some invisible car. The stretch of the old bridge was under repair, flanked by orange cones and posted at 40 kilometers per hour. I slowed down. The drizzle turned into a downpour, and the windshield wipers were hitting twice as fast. Suddenly, Leo let out a strangled scream and stretched out his arm. There, in the middle of the curve, the high beam hit a boy standing on the white line, barefoot, soaked. His eyes looked empty, black, pure instinct. I slammed on the brakes and steered. The trailer skidded. The load rattled, but I managed to pull over without rolling over. "Did you see that?" Leo stammered. "Yes," I answered, my throat dry. I checked the mirrors. Nothing, no sign of the child, no footprints in the puddle, just the wet tape shimmering. Under the hidden moon, I took a deep breath and started off again, this time at a snail's pace. The old bridge leading into a very long descent. I barely pressed the accelerator when the air gauge plummeted, and the brake pedal became as hard as stone. The trailer began to pick up speed despite the load. I felt the weight pulling toward the abyss of the slope. "They won't stop," I said, pulling the engine brake. The dashboard became a festival of red lights. Leo held onto the dashboard while I pumped the pedal with all my might. Nothing. Then, turning my head, I saw him, the same boy, sitting on the bunk bed, feet dangling, swaying as if enjoying a hammock. His skin was ashen, his shirt stuck to him, and where eyes should have been, there was only a wet sheen. "I saw you in the mirror earlier," I murmured, more to myself than to him. My mind flashed back to the mechanic's advice. If you see him and don't stop, your trailer will lose its brakes. I'd seen him before, and here were the consequences. I blasted the horn to warn traffic and, almost instinctively, turned off all the interior lights. The boy vanished. At the same second, I heard the hiss of compressed air return, and the pedal pressed, the pressure returned to the green range. I slammed on the brakes, and the vehicle stopped, leaving black marks on the asphalt. Leo and I got out in the rain. The water stung our faces from the cold. I checked every line of the pneumatic system with the flashlight. It was intact, not a single leak, not a single blown fuse. Leo kept saying that he saw the boy whose eyes looked like two holes leading nowhere. When we managed to calm down, we swore not to say a word for the rest of the ride. We arrived at the Maltraitor junction. At dawn, Leo got off, pale, thanked me with a broken voice, and disappeared into the toll booth. When I handed the vehicle back to the base, the supervisor noticed my face and asked if I had stumbled upon the construction site. I told him the gist without mentioning ghosts. He nodded gravely. That kid was real. He was killed years ago by a tractor-trailer without brakes. They say the driver couldn't stop because the system instantly gave out. Since that night, every time my route includes kilometer 242, I stop a minute before the curve, get out, walk in the rain or under a clear sky, and leave a metal stroller on the guardrail. It's my way of reminding him that I saw him, that I stopped, and of praying that his empty eyes never need to be reflected in my mirrors again. Mirage of Highway 50, good night. My name is Ricardo, and I've been a truck driver for almost 30 years, most of them traveling the endless highways of the United States. I've seen it all, or so I thought, from storms that seemed like the end of the world to accidents that made your blood run cold. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I experienced on Route 50, what they call the loneliest road. In America, crossing Nevada, it was a stifling July night, even past midnight. I hadn't met a soul for hours, only the yellow line swallowed up by my headlights and the monotonous hum of the engine. My wife, Carmen, had called me a couple of hours earlier, worried, as always. I told her everything was fine, that I'd be back in Reno in the morning. The truth is, I was starting to feel the weight of fatigue, that drowsiness that clouds one's judgment. It was then that I saw, in the distance, some flickering lights on the flat, dark horizon. They weren't from a car. They were more like campfires or something, but they were moving strangely, erratically. I thought maybe they were other truckers, stopped, or some kind of campsite. As I got closer, the lights seemed to dance, rising and falling. The truck's air conditioning seemed to lose power, and an unnatural chill began to seep into the cab. Despite the desert heat, the radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly began to emit static, and between the crackles, I thought I heard whispers, unintelligible words. I turned off the radio, feeling a chill run down my spine. The lights were now closer, on the side of the road. They weren't campfires. They were tall, thin figures, as if made of the desert darkness itself, but with those glowing eyes, which were the lights I'd seen. They moved in an incorrect way, as if their limbs were bent at impossible angles. I tried to rationalize it. It's fatigue, Ricardo, I told myself. You're seeing things. But the cold was real. The acrid smell, like ozone and something else, something metallic and organic at the same time, was real too. I passed them. They didn't turn to look at me, but I felt their eyes, if they were eyes, staring at me. There were 7, maybe 8 figures. They made no sound, just that oppressive presence. I checked the rearview mirror. They were still there, motionless. Their lights dimmer now. I accelerated, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, one of my rear tires blew out with a loud bang that made me swerve. I managed to control the truck and stop it on the shoulder. I cursed my luck. Changing a tire in the middle of nowhere with those things around. I pulled out of the truck, lug wrench in hand, more like a weapon than a tool. The air was frigid. I looked back. The figures were gone. Momentary relief coursed through me, but it was replaced by even greater terror when I heard a faint metallic tapping coming from inside my trailer. I froze. The trailer was sealed. I had checked it before leaving. The tapping became more insistent. Then a sound like something dragging. It couldn't be an animal. The way it sounded, it was deliberate. I don't know where I got the strength from, but I wasn't going to open that trailer. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and drove on, with the flat tire slowly at first, then faster, not caring about the damage I might cause. I drove like that for almost an hour until I reached a well-lit gas station in a small town. When I checked the trailer with the gas station attendant as a witness, there was nothing, but the inside of the metal door had deep scratches, like something had tried to get out, and the smell, that same acrid, metallic smell, was permeating the canvas. I never took Route 50 at night again, and sometimes when I'm alone on the highway and see strange lights in the distance, I grip the steering wheel and pray it's just my imagination. But I know what I saw that night was real, and I know that, for a moment, something in that desert tried to come to me. The forgotten stop. Good evening, everyone. My name is Alina, and although I've been working in an office for a few years now to pay for college, I worked with my uncle in his small transportation company. We made short trips, mainly transporting agricultural goods through the Bajío states of Mexico. What I'm about to tell you happened to me one rainy afternoon while I was returning from delivering a fertilizer order near the Guanajuato-Jalisco border. My uncle was driving, and I was sitting in the passenger seat, half asleep. The rain was torrential, and the secondary road we were traveling was a complete washout. To avoid a stretch we knew was prone to flooding, my uncle decided to take a detour, a dirt road that, according to an old map, was a shortcut to the highway. "Trust me, Elenita," he said with a smile. "I know these roads like the back of my hand." We'd been on that goat track for maybe half an hour, mud splashing up to the windows, when the truck sputtered and stopped. We were out of gas. My uncle let out a string of curses. We were in the middle of nowhere. The sky was grey, and the rain was relentless. There was no cell phone service, of course. After some discussion, we decided I would stay in the truck, and he would walk back to the last intersection we'd seen, where he remembered a shack that sometimes sold gasoline illegally. He put a tarp over himself and left, promising to return as soon as possible. An hour passed, then 2. The rain turned into a fine but persistent drizzle. Darkness was beginning to fall. I started to get really worried. It was then, through the mist and wind-twisted trees, that I saw a faint light. A small, barely legible wooden sign that read, "Fonda, the miraculous food and rest." It seemed like a miracle to me. How could we have missed it as we drove by? Perhaps with the rain, I decided to go closer. The inn was a squat, adobe building with a small doorway and a single illuminated window. As I entered, the smell of burning wood and cooking comforted me. There were a few wooden tables, and at the back, a plump older woman with her grey hair tied back in a bun and a stained apron. She was stirring something in a large pot on a stove. "Good night, my daughter," she said in a surprisingly sweet voice. "What brings you out to these lonely places?" I explained my situation. The broken down truck, my uncle who hadn't returned. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it happens sometimes. The road is treacherous. Sit down, I'll give you a bowl of broth. It will settle your body." I was so hungry and so cold that I accepted without hesitation. As I ate the broth, which was delicious, I noticed some strange things. There were no other customers, and there was no cooking noise except for the bubbling of the pot. The walls were bare except for a dark wooden crucifix and an old sepia photograph of a very serious family. The woman didn't say much, just watched me with a kind but empty smile. When I finished, I asked her if she'd seen my uncle, a tall man with a hat, I described. She shook her head. "No one's been around here in days, Mia. You're all alone." A shiver ran through me. How was that possible? Then she offered me a place to stay. "I have a small room in the back. You can spend the night. Tomorrow, with daylight, everything looks better." The idea suddenly terrified me. There was something about her insistence, about the stillness of the place. "No, thank you," I said, getting up. "I must return to the truck. Perhaps my uncle has already returned." I offered to pay for the broth, but she refused. "It's a courtesy of the House for Lost Travelers," she said, and her smile widened a little. I left the inn almost running. The drizzle had stopped, but the night was as dark as pitch. When I got to where the truck should have been, it wasn't there. The road continued, but there was no sign of it. Desperate, I began to scream my uncle's name. Only the echoes answered. Me, weeping, I retraced my steps toward the inn, thinking I might have taken the wrong path. But where the miraculous had once stood, there was now only a clearing among the trees, overgrown with weeds, and the remains of very old stone foundations, as if a building had stood there many years ago, but not recently. There was no light, no path, nothing. I fell to my knees, terrified and confused. Had I gone crazy? Had I dreamed about the inn, the broth, the woman? But I could still taste the stew in my mouth. I don't know how long I was there, but at dawn I heard the engine of a tractor. It was a local farmer. When I trembled, telling him about the inn, he looked at me with pity. "My daughter," he said, "there hasn't been an inn around here for over 50 years. There was one like this one, the Miraculous, but it burned down with everyone. Inside, they say the owner sometimes appears to lost travelers, offering them comfort and eternal companionship." My uncle appeared hours later. He had gotten lost. He had spent the night in an abandoned tool shed and at dawn found the main road. When I told him my story, he paled. We never took an unfamiliar shortcut again. Sometimes when I eat a hot broth, I can't help but shiver and wonder what would have happened to me if I had agreed to stay that night at La Maracrasa. The night, Owl's last journey, I'm going to tell you a story that still gives me goosebumps, and it's been a good few years. My name is Miguel, and back then, I was a night delivery driver for a delivery company on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. I covered those remote industrial and residential areas that at night seem like another world. I liked the solitude, the quiet of the empty streets, or so I thought. One night, as I was almost off shift, around 3 a.m., I had one last delivery. The address was strange, in a wooded area I barely knew, at the end of a dirt road with no barriers. The package label only said for the unnamed resident, and the house, according to the GPS, was pretty isolated. When I arrived, the house gave me a bad feeling. It was an old, two-story, run-down Victorian with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. All the lights were off, except for a very dim one in an upstairs window that flickered like a candle. I thought maybe they were sleeping, but the instructions said, priority delivery, knock until opened. I sighed. I hated disturbing people at that hour. I got out of the van, package in hand. The air was heavy, humid, and a silence enveloped the place. No crickets, no wind rustling through the trees, just the crunch of my footsteps on the gravel path. I rang the bell, nothing. I rang it again, louder. I waited for a minute that seemed like an eternity. Just as I was about to leave a note, the door opened with a slow creak, like in a horror movie. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man, or at least he looked like one, tall, very thin, hunched over. He was wearing a dark, old-fashioned suit, and his face was shadowed. But what I could see chilled my blood, pale, almost translucent. Skin stretched over prominent cheekbones, and his eyes were large, dark, and unblinking. "Yes," he said in a voice that was barely a raspy whisper, as if he hadn't used it in a long time. "Good evening. I have a package for the resident." I stammered, handing him the package and the sign-in clipboard. He made no move to take it, just stared at me, hardly. I felt a wave of irrational dread. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. "Ah yes, the package," he finally whispered. His hands emerged from the shadows of his sleeves. They were long, with bony fingers and curved yellowish nails. He took the package with exasperating slowness. Then he picked up the pen to sign. I saw his hand tremble slightly, or maybe it was me who was trembling, as he signed, or rather scribbled. Something illegible. I noticed a strange smell, sweet and musty at the same time, like wilted flowers and old dust, and a chill that didn't belong with the Texas night. "Thank you," I said, taking the clipboard and instinctively stepping back. He just nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving me, and then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a distortion of his features, a grimace that revealed teeth that were too long, too pointy. I turned and practically ran to the van. I started the engine and got out of there as fast as I could along the dirt road, the lights of the house disappearing between the trees. I didn't look back until I was back on the paved road. The next day, at the office, I mentioned the strange delivery to my supervisor. He checked the records. "That's odd," he said, frowning. "That address shouldn't be on our route. In fact, according to our maps, that house has been abandoned for more than 20 years after the last owner, well, let's just say, met an unpleasant end." I felt my blood run cold. We reviewed the signature on the tablet. It was a scribble, yes, but between the sinuous lines, a word was barely sketched out: "Thank you." But not for the package, but for the visit. I asked to be rerouted. A few weeks later, out of pure morbid curiosity, I drove past the entrance to that dirt road again during the day. It was blocked by a rusty chain and a no-entry sign. Vegetation had almost completely covered it, as if nature itself wanted to erase all traces of that place. I still wonder who or what received that package, and sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think I hear that raspy whisper and feel those eyes fixed on me. It was my last trip as a night owl. The passenger on the Rumorosa. Good night. My name is Armando, and I was a passenger bus driver for 15 years, primarily covering the Tijuana-Mexicali route. If you're familiar with that route, you know it involves crossing the Rumorosa, that mountain road famous for both its dangerous curves and its legends. I was skeptical, you know. I heard the stories from my colleagues about the dancing girl, about the phantom truck driver, all nonsense, I thought. This happened on a cold, foggy winter night, one of those that makes the Rumorosa seem like the mouth of hell. We were with just a few passengers, maybe 10. It was around 2 in the morning. The road was deserted. Visibility was terrible. I was concentrating, all 5 senses alert, passing one of the sharpest curves, where there is a small chapel and many crosses at the edge of the cliff. I saw a figure on the side of the road, a woman making desperate gestures. We don't normally stop in unauthorized places, especially in the Rumorosa at night. But something about her small figure and the urgency of her gestures made me stop. She must be desperate, I thought. I opened the door and she got in. She was young, maybe 25, thin, pale, with her dark hair plastered to her face from the humidity. She was wearing a simple white dress that seemed too light for the mountain cold. She was carrying a small bundle. Thank you so much," she said in a soft voice, almost a whisper. My car broke down further back. I need to get to Mexicali. My mother is sick. Sure, get in, I told her. She didn't pay the fare, and I didn't ask her to. She sat in one of the front seats, right behind me. I watched her in the rearview mirror. Her gaze was lost, sad. A musty, flowery smell, like tuberoses, reached me. We continued the journey in silence for a while. The other passengers were dozing or staring out the fogged-up windows. Every now and then, I glanced at the girl in the rearview mirror. She remained the same, motionless, with that infinite sadness in her eyes. I felt sorry for her. As we began the descent toward Mexicali, the fog began to dissipate a little. That's when she spoke to me. "Sir," she said, her voice so low I could barely hear it. "Could you drop me off here, please? Near the cemetery." I was surprised. The cemetery was still on the outskirts of the city, in a dark area. But, miss, we're still a long way off. "Are you sure?" "Yes, please. It's fine here," she insisted. Just as gently, I shrugged and pulled the bus over. She stood up. "Thank you very much for your kindness, sir. May God reward you." And she got out, quickly disappearing into the darkness at the side of the road toward the cemetery. Something didn't sit right with me. That smell of tuberoses, her paleness, her clothes. When we arrived at the Mexicali terminal, as the few remaining passengers were getting off, one of them, an elderly gentleman, approached me. "Excuse me, driver," he said. "May I know why you stopped back there, where there was nothing?" "What do you mean, nothing?" I replied. "I left the girl who got on the Rumorosa, the one in the white dress." The man looked at me with wide eyes, and then with an expression of almost pity. "Friend," he said in a low voice, "no girl got on this bus in the Rumorosa. The same people came from Tijuana. I didn't fall asleep the whole way. I felt a pit in my stomach." He was making fun of me, but his face was serious. I checked the bus. There was no sign of her. The seat where she had sat was cold, as if no one had ever occupied it, but the smell, the faint scent of tuberoses, lingered in the air. The next day, on my way back, I couldn't avoid it. I stopped near the cemetery where I'd left her. There were fresh flowers on some graves, and on one of them a worn marble headstone. I read the name Alina G., died in 1988 at age 24. There was a small, oval photo embedded in the stone. It was her, the girl in the white dress. Since then, I believe the stories of the Rumorosa, and every time I cross it at night and see someone waving, I keep going. Because I've learned that sometimes those who ask for help on that road aren't from this world and are perhaps just looking for someone to accompany them on their eternal journey. The town that wasn't there, good evening. I'm Javier, and although I'm now an engineer, in my younger years after college and before getting a stable job, I spent a summer road tripping across the American Southwest. I wanted adventure, sightseeing, and I found it, but not the kind I expected. I was driving through New Mexico, on one of those back roads that seemed like an endless straight line toward the horizon. The sun was beating down. The air conditioning in my old car was barely keeping up, and I hadn't seen another soul in hours. My plan was to get to a small town called Redemption, which was marked on my map, spend the night, and continue the next day. According to the map, Redemption shouldn't be far away, and sure enough, around a gentle bend came a worm-eaten wooden sign, "Welcome to Redemption, Pop 127. The town itself was strange, a handful of faded adobe houses, a general store with its sign hanging by a hinge, a gas station with rusty pullouts, and a small church with a crooked steeple. Everything seemed covered in a fine layer of reddish dust, and a heavy silence hung in the air. I parked in front of the general store. There was no one in sight. "Hello," I called as I entered. The interior was dark and smelled musty. An older man with tanned skin like leather and small, beady eyes appeared from the shadows. "Good afternoon," he said in a gruff voice. "What can I help you with?" "I'm looking for a place to spend the night," I replied. "Is there a motel around here?" He looked me up and down slowly. "The only motel closed years ago, but I can rent you a room above the store if you don't mind the rustic feel." I agreed, more out of tiredness than anything else. The room was basic: a bed, a chair, and a window overlooking the main street, or whatever that was. I dropped off my things and went downstairs to get something to eat. The man served me a bowl of chili con carne that was strangely cold. While I ate, I tried to make conversation with him. "Are there many people around here?" I asked. "There must be one," he replied without looking at me. I was starting to feel uneasy. The townspeople, the few I saw passing by the window, a woman sweeping a non-existent porch, a couple of children playing silently with a stick seemed to move slowly as if in a dream. Their gazes were empty, distant, and they all wore old-fashioned clothes from the 1950s or 1960s. In the afternoon, I tried using the payphone next to the gas station to call my family. There was no dial tone. The gas station attendant, another taciturn man, told me the line had been down for some time. The feeling of unreality grew. I tried tuning the car radio, only to get static. My wristwatch had stopped. The food in the general store had faded. Labels and the products looked like they'd been on the shelves for decades. As dusk fell, the town plunged into near total darkness. Only a few yellowish lights flickered here and there. I went upstairs to my room, locked the door with the small deadbolt, and sat down on my bed. Feeling a tightness in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped, that something was fundamentally wrong with redemption. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise, a low, monotonous chanting that seemed to be coming from the church. I cautiously peeked out the window. The church was lit inside, a flickering orange light like candles, and I saw shadows, moving hooded figures moving in and out. Fear gripped me. This wasn't normal. I grabbed my backpack, tiptoed down the stairs, dropped some bills on the counter, and stepped outside. The chanting continued. I started the car, the engine thundering in the silence, and sped out of redemption without looking back. I drove all night until the sun began to rise. I stopped in the first large town I found, and now I was calmer. I bought a new, more detailed map of the area. I looked up redemption. It didn't appear on any map. I asked several people, including local police officers. No one had heard of a town called Redemption in that area. I returned along the same secondary road a few days later, plucking up courage and in broad daylight. I wanted to convince myself I'd dreamed it. I reached the spot where the turnoff should have been. The wooden sign, there was nothing. Just desert, no sign of houses, the store, or the church. It was as if redemption had never existed. To this day, I don't know what I experienced. A fever dream from the heat, a hallucination, but I remember the taste of cold chili, the shopkeeper's blank stare, the chanting in the night, and sometimes, when I see an old map, I search for redemption with the hope and terror of finding it again. Echoes in Copper Canyon greetings. My name is Dr. Alejandro Herrera. I'm an archaeologist, or at least I was actively involved until a few years ago. My specialty is the pre-Hispanic cultures of northern Mexico. What I'm about to tell you isn't a glorious discovery, but rather something that made me question the limits of our knowledge and, frankly, my own sanity. It happened in the Tarahumara Mountains, deep in Copper Canyon. We were on an expedition, a small team, 2 graduate students, a Raramuri guide named Mateo, and me. We were looking for a specific site, a cave mentioned in some very old journals, of a 17th century Jesuit missionary. The missionary spoke of ancient voices and shadows dancing in the stone stories. I had dismissed as superstitions of the time. We had been hiking for 3 days, deep into a remote part of the canyon where few ventured. Mateo, normally talkative and full of stories, had become quiet and sullen as we approached the area marked on the Jesuits' maps. "Bad place," he sometimes muttered. "The ancients do not rest well here." Finally, we found the cave. The entrance was half hidden by vegetation, a dark mouth in the canyon wall. The air emanating from it was cold, noticeably colder than outside, and had a peculiar smell, like damp earth and something more metallic, almost electric. We turned on our flashlights and went in. The cave was larger than we expected, a series of natural galleries and chambers. The walls were covered with strange rock formations, and in some places there were, indeed, very old petroglyphs of a style I didn't recognize. They weren't your typical Raramuri designs. They were more abstract and disturbing. While my students were documenting the engravings, I went a little further, following a narrow passageway. That's when I started to hear it. At first, I thought it was the echo of our own voices or the wind filtering through some crack. But the sound became clearer. They were whispers, not in Spanish or Raramuri. It was a guttural tongue full of clicks and hisses. I called to Mateo. He refused to go beyond the first chamber. "It's them," his pale face said in the light of his flashlight. "Those who lived before don't like to be disturbed." I, the the scientist, tried to reason. It must be the wind, Matteo, the natural acoustics of the cave. But a part of me knew it wasn't that. The whispers seemed to have a cadence, almost an intention. Suddenly, our flashlights began to flicker. One of my students' flashlights went out completely. A cold panic began to invade me. The whispers grew. Louder, more insistent, as if they were surrounding us. And then we saw the shadows. They weren't our shadows. They were dark figures gliding across the walls, elongated, distorted, moving independently in the light of our flickering lanterns. They had no definite shape, but evoked something vaguely humanoid, with limbs too long, heads too small. Danced, just as the missionary had written. One of my students screamed. I myself felt a primal terror I had never experienced before. The whispers turned into a cacophony of harsh voices, and the cold intensified until it became painful. I felt a pressure on my chest, as if something invisible was trying to crush me. Come out, now, I shouted, pushing my students toward the entrance. Matteo was already there, pulling them along. We stumbled, fell, and got up with those shadows, twisting around us, and the voices scratching at our ears. When we finally emerged into the sunlight, we tumbled to the ground. We looked back. The cave entrance seemed dark and still. The sounds had ceased, but the smell, that metallic old earth smell, lingered. We gathered our things and headed back without saying a word. Matteo led us along a different, longer route, but far from that cave. We never published anything about those petroglyphs. My students were too traumatized, and I couldn't find a rational explanation. Mass hysteria, underground gases causing hallucinations. Perhaps, but the whispers, the dancing shadows, felt too real, too deliberate. Years later, I still hear those whispers in my nightmares. And I've come to believe that there are places in the world where the past isn't dead, it's not even past. It simply waits in the darkness for someone to disturb its sleep. And the old ones sometimes aren't friendly. Lights in the Arizona desert, good evening. My name is Samuel. For several years, in the late 1990s, I was a security guard at a fairly large communications antenna facility, lost in the middle of the Arizona desert. A lonely job, especially on the night shift, which was my favorite dot piece and quiet just me, the stars, and the occasional hum of the equipment. One August night, the heat was still intense, even though it was past 2 a.m. I was making my usual rounds around the perimeter of the facility, a fairly long chain-link fence. The sky was incredibly clear, the kind that allows you to see the Milky Way in all its splendor. I always loved the desert. As I walked along the west side, farthest from the small control building, I noticed something strange in the sky. At first I thought it was an airplane or maybe a satellite, but the lights weren't behaving like anything I'd ever seen before. They were 3 bright, white dots next to each other, forming a perfect triangle. They moved in absolute silence, without the sound of jet engines or propellers. I stood still, watching them through my binoculars. The lights moved slowly, then stopped, then changed direction instantly, at a speed that defied any known aircraft. They didn't flicker like airplane lights. They were constant and bright. Felt a chill. Despite the heat, this wasn't normal. I tried to radio back to headquarters, but all I got was static. Something was interfering with the signal. The hair on my arms stood up. The lights began to descend very slowly toward an area of the desert, about 2 or 3 kilometers from my position. They remained in that perfect triangular formation, dot, as they were descending. One of them emitted a flash of light toward the ground, a perfect cone of white light that illuminated a circle in the sand. Then it all went away. I stood there, frozen between fear and a strange fascination with what I was witnessing. I never believed in UFOs or anything like that. I'd always been a practical guy, but there was no logical explanation for that. The three lights remained suspended very close to the ground for what seemed like about 10 minutes. Although it's difficult to say exactly, time seemed to distort. I couldn't hear anything, not the wind, not the coyotes that sometimes howled in the distance. An oppressive silence. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights ascended with incredible speed, vertically until they became 3 small dots in the sky, and then they disappeared without a sound. Without a trail, they simply vanished. The radio was back up and running. My supervisor was calling, asking if everything was okay, since I hadn't reported my position in a while. I doubted I was going to tell him I'd seen alien lights. He'd laugh at me. "Everything's fine, boss," I answered. "Just a false alarm with a coyote near the fence." But I knew better. For the rest of the night, and for many nights afterward, I couldn't get the image of those lights out of my head, their impossible movement, their absolute silence. I began to discreetly investigate. I discovered that that area of Arizona had a history of strange sightings, but they were always second-hand stories, urban legends. Mine hadn't been a legend. I'd seen it with my own eyes. A couple of weeks later, during the day, I drove my truck to the area where I thought the lights had descended. I wasn't expecting to find anything, and that's what I found. Just sand and brush. But as I walked around the area, I noticed something. In a circle about 20 meters in diameter, the sand looked different. It was as if glazed in places, with a strange, almost crystalline texture. And the few plants within that circle were dry and dead, while everything around them remained the same. I never told anyone in detail what I saw for fear of being thought crazy. But that night changed my perception of the universe. I no longer gaze at the starry sky with the same tranquility. Now I know we are not alone, and that sometimes, in the vastness of the desert, under the cover of night, things happen that we simply cannot explain. And perhaps it's better that way. The Sierra Madre contract. Good night, God bless you, I'm afraid. And what I'm about to tell you happened to me many years ago when I was a young muleteer in the Sierra Madre Occidental near Durango. Life was hard then, and sometimes desperation makes you take paths you never would have imagined. My family was going through a very difficult time. My father had fallen seriously ill. The crops had been lost due to a terrible drought, and we were drowning in debt. I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. One night, in a tavern in the nearest town, I heard some old men talking in low voices about Don Malverde, a man who lived isolated deep in the mountains and who, they said, could fix any problem for a price. Desperate, I asked more. I was given vague directions. I was warned that it was dangerous, that dealing with that man was no game. But the sight of my father wasting away and my mother weeping silently gave me the courage, or the stupidity, to try. The next morning, I took my best mule, some water, and some tortillas, and headed into the mountains following the directions I'd been given. It was a nearly 2-day journey along barely marked trails, up and down mountains. I finally reached a small, hidden valley where there was an adobe and stone hut with smoke drifting lazily from a chimney. A man came out to greet me. He wasn't what I'd imagined. He wasn't old, nor did he look sinister. He was a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore simple peasant clothes, but there was an authority about him, a presence that commanded respect and a little fear. "I knew you would come, Ephraim," he said, and my blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone my name. He invited me in. The house was dark. It smelled of dried herbs and something else, a sweet, penetrating smell I couldn't identify. He offered me a drink of something that looked like mezcal, but tasted of earth and oblivion. I told him my sorrows, my despair. He listened silently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he looked at me intently. "I can help you, boy," he said. "Your father will be healed. Your land will bear fruit again, and your debts will disappear like smoke. But everything comes at a price." "What price?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled again, that cold smile. "A small thing, a service, something you'll value greatly. But in time, you'll realize you can live without, let's say, your first happy memory with your firstborn." I didn't quite understand. My first happy memory. How could anyone take a memory? It seemed crazy, but desperation was stronger. "That's all?" I asked. "That's all," he confirmed. "Think of it as a contract. I'll keep my end of the bargain, and when the time comes, you'll keep yours." I agreed. What else could I do? There were no papers or signatures, just his word and mine, sealed with another sip of that strange beverage. He told me to go back home, that everything would be fine, and it was. When I returned, I found my father sitting on the porch, smiling with a brighter smile than he had in months. The rains came that same week, and the land miraculously turned green again. Some distant relatives sent us money, enough to pay off all our debts. My life changed. Years passed, and I married a good woman, Rosalva, and we had a son, Matteo. I remember the day he was born. The immense joy I felt holding him in my arms for the first time was such a pure, overwhelming feeling. A few days later, as I rocked Matteo in the hammock, I tried to remember that first moment, that burst of happiness, and I couldn't. There was a void. I knew I'd been happy, but I couldn't recall the feeling, the clear image. It was like looking at a blurry photograph. All the other memories of Matteo were there, crystal clear, but that first one was gone. Then I understood the contract. Don Melverde had exacted his price. I lived a good life. My family prospered, but I always carried that shadow, that emptiness, the stolen memory of my first happiness with my son. Sometimes, on full moon nights, when the wind blew from the mountains, I thought I smelled that sweet, penetrating aroma of his shack and felt a chill. I never looked for Don Malverde again. I don't know if he's still there, in that hidden valley, but I learned that there are debts that are paid with more than just money, and that the easy paths offered by desperation often lead to very dark places, and that some contracts, once made, cannot be broken. The burden of whispers good. Evening to all of you listening, in the solitude of your roads or in the quiet of your homes. My name is Javier Mendoza, and for 20 years I've been a truck driver, crisscrossing the highways of Mexico and, occasionally, the United States. I've seen it all: terrible accidents, devastating landscapes, and sunrises that take your breath away. But what I'm going to tell you tonight is something I'd rather forget, something that still makes me look twice at the load on my trailer. This happened about 5 years ago. I was working for a small company, one of those that takes on freight that the big guys disdain. I had a family to support, my wife and 2 young children, so I wasn't too picky about my travel. That time, I was assigned to transport a sealed shipment from a warehouse outside Laredo, Texas, to a private collector somewhere in the remote mountains of Chihuahua. The paperwork was minimal, almost suspicious. Fragile antiques, it said. The container was sealed with weights and padlocks that didn't seem from this century. The route was long and lonely, especially as I crossed the border and headed deeper into Mexico on secondary roads. The first night was normal. I stopped at a trucker's boarding house, ate something, and slept for a few hours. But on the second day, as the sun set and turned the sky a bloody orange, I began to hear things. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible murmurs, which I thought were the result of the wind or fatigue. But as night drew in, the whispers became clearer. They were coming from the trailer. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky. I turned off the engine, and the desert silence grew dense and oppressive. And then I heard them again, voices, many voices, whispering in a language I couldn't understand, but which conveyed a palpable anguish, an infinite sadness. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who's there?" I screamed, even though I knew it was. Stupid, only the echo answered me, followed by a new wave of those whispered wails. My heart was racing. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps trapped animals or some electronic device had been activated, but deep down I knew it was neither. There was something deeply unnatural about those sounds. I cautiously approached the trailer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The seals were intact. I pressed my ear to the cold sheet of the container, and the whispers became a torrent, as if dozens of souls were trapped inside, pleading. A sickening, sweet smell, like wilted flowers and damp earth, emanated from inside. Fear gripped me. I ran back to the cabin, started the engine, and pressed the accelerator to the floor. I didn't care about the speed or the bumps. I just wanted to get away from that burden. For the rest of the drive, the whispers accompanied me, sometimes louder, sometimes weaker, but always there. I didn't dare stop to sleep. I drove for almost 30 hours straight, fueled by coffee and terror. My mind began to play tricks on me. I saw shadows in the rearview mirrors. I felt presences in the cabin. When I finally arrived at my destination, a dilapidated hacienda in the middle of the mountains, I nearly collapsed from exhaustion and relief. An elderly man, with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, greeted me without a word. He and a pair of equally sinister assistants opened the container. I didn't want to look as they unloaded the antiquities, which from the corner of my eye looked like crudely crafted wooden boxes, some engraved with strange symbols. The whispers ceased. The air felt lighter. The old man paid me a considerable sum in cash and said in a raspy voice, "Some cargoes are best left unquestioned, son. Forget what you heard. I didn't need to be told again." I took the money and got out of there as fast as I could. I quit that job soon after. Nightmares about those whispers haunted me for months. Sometimes, when I'm alone on the road in the middle of the night, I think I hear them again, faint, distant, reminding me that there are things in this world best left sealed and forgotten. Hangman's Curve, how are you? My name is Rodrigo Benavides. I was a truck driver for almost 30 years, mostly traveling the highways of northern Mexico. I've seen my share of strange things, the kind that make you wonder if you're awake or dreaming. But there's one story, an experience that's been seared into my memory. It happened on a stretch of the freeway to Saltillo, a place we old drivers used to call Hangman's Curve. It was a winter night, cold as few others. A thick fog had rolled in, the kind that sticks to the windshield and barely lets you see a couple of meters ahead. I was carrying a shipment of steel, and my co-pilot was in a hurry, as I had to deliver it before dawn. The truck's heater barely made a dent in the chill that seeped in through every crack. I was tired, my eyes irritated from straining in the dim light. I knew this route well, but the fog turned it into an unfamiliar maze. Hangman's Curve had a bad reputation. They said that years ago a man had hanged himself from a stunted mesquite tree that grew right at the apex of the sharpest curve. There were stories of apparitions, of shadows crossing the road, of cars swerving without explanation. I, to be honest, had never really believed in such things. To me, they were just tales to scare uninitiated drivers. That night, however, I began to feel uneasy long before I reached the curve, a tightness in my chest, as if the air had become heavy. The radio began to fail, only emitting static. I attributed it to the bad weather and the mountainous area, but the feeling that something wasn't right grew with every kilometer. As I approached the fateful point, the fog grew even denser. I slowed down almost to a walking pace. The truck's high beams barely penetrated the milky whiteness, and then I saw it. At first, it was just a dark, fuzzy silhouette on the side of the road, right where the old mesquite tree was supposed to be. I thought it was a large branch, an animal, something. But as I got closer, the shape became more defined. It was a man. He was standing motionless, his back to the road, looking down the ravine. He was wearing dark, threadbare clothes, and above his head, though the fog blurred it, I could make out something that looked like a rope. My first instinct was to slow down, to help, but something stopped me. An irrational, icy fear paralyzed me. The man wasn't moving. He wasn't reacting to the sound of my engine, as if I didn't exist. As I slowly passed him, I couldn't help but stare. I didn't see his face, only his hunched back and the rope stretching into the darkness above him. A pungent smell of wet earth and something else, something indefinably sad, filled the cabin. I had barely passed a figure when I felt a sharp jerk on the trailer, as if something heavy had caught on it. The truck lurched. I slammed on the brakes, with all my might, fighting the steering wheel to stay on the road. In the brief moment the fog swirled, I saw the man's silhouette right behind my trailer, as if glued to it. And then nothing, just the fog. By the time I managed to stop the truck completely, my heart was hammering in my chest, as if it wanted to escape. I got out, shaking, a lug wrench in my hand, ready to face whatever was coming. I circled the truck. There was nothing, not a scratch on the trailer, no sign that anything had been caught. The mesquite tree stood there, twisted and alone, with no rope hanging from its branches. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to understand what I had seen. Was it fatigue, the fog, my imagination? But that feeling of terror, that smell, were all too real. I returned to the cabin and continued on my way, but it wasn't the same anymore. Every shadow, every noise startled me. I delivered the load, and on the way back, with daylight and no more fog, I stopped at the curve. Nothing unusual was there, just the mesquite trees and the silence of the desert. But I knew what I had seen. From that night on, I avoided Hangman's Curve whenever I could, and if I ever had to pass by it at night, I'd say an hour farther and not look at the mesquite tree. Some say that man's soul still suffers, searching for someone to keep him company in his loneliness. I don't know what to think, but there are nights when I close my eyes and still see that dark silhouette and that rope swinging in the fog, the ghost gas station greetings. Let me tell you something that happened to me on one of those long drives through the Arizona desert a few years ago. My name is Carlos Ramirez, and although I'm now retired, driving was my life for over 35 years. You learn to know the road, its rhythms, its dangers, but sometimes the road shows you things that defy all logic. It was the middle of summer, hellishly hot. I was crossing Arizona on my way to California with a shipment of electronics. The sun was beating down, and my old Kenworth's air conditioning struggled to keep me cool. I hadn't seen a soul for hours, just the ribbon of asphalt stretching toward a horizon vibrating with heat. The fuel gauge was dangerously low. I knew there was an exit with a gas station marked on the map about 20 miles away. But the map was old, and you never know in those remote areas. Anxiety began to grow. Staying stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't an option. Finally, I saw the sign. Gas, food, next exit. Relief washed over me. I took the exit, a dusty dirt road that led into the desert. In the distance, I saw the silhouette of an old-fashioned gas station with a single pump and a small building that also looked like a convenience store. As I approached, I noticed the place looked run down, almost abandoned. The paint was peeling. The windows were dirty, but the lights were on, and I saw a figure moving behind the counter. Well, at least it's open, I thought. I stopped the truck next to the single pump, which looked like something out of a 1950s movie. I stepped out of the cab, and the heat hit me like a hammer. An eerie silence enveloped the place. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the faint hum of an old neon sign flickering irregularly above the door. Open, I approached the store door. Inside was an older man with sunburned skin and hollow, empty eyes. He stared at me blankly from behind a counter piled with dusty knickknacks. "Good afternoon," I said. "Can I fill up the tank?" The man nodded slowly, wordlessly. I went out and started filling up the tank. The pump was working, to my surprise, although the gallon and price counter seemed stuck. While I waited, I looked round. Everything seemed frozen in time. There was a calendar on the store wall, visible through the dirty window, marked the year. 1973. A yellowed newspaper on a chair on the porch had headlines that seemed from that era. A feeling of unreality began to invade me. The smell of the place was strange, of old dust and something metallic, like rust. When the tank was full, I went back inside to pay. The man still stood there, motionless. I asked him how much it was. His lips moved, but he didn't make a sound. Then, with a shaky hand, he pointed to a small handwritten sign, $20 per full tank. It seemed cheap to me, too cheap for the amount I'd put in. But I didn't want to argue. I took out a $20 bill and placed it on the counter. His ice-cold fingers brushed mine as he took the money. A shiver ran through me despite the oppressive heat. "Do you have anything to drink? Cold water?" I asked, trying to break the tension. The man just slowly shook his head, his eyes fixed on something behind me. I decided it was best to leave. "Thanks," I said, and I got out of there as quickly as I could. As I got into the truck, I took one last look at the store. The man was now standing in the doorway, looking at me, and for the first time, a slight smile, if you could even call it that, appeared on his lips. It was a hollow, haunting smile. I started the car and drove off down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust. When I got back to the main road, I felt like I'd escaped something. A few hours later, I pulled into a busy, modern rest area. I told another trucker about the strange gas station. He looked at me like I was crazy. "Dude," he said, "there aren't any gas stations for 20 miles around that area. There used to be one, but it closed down over 30 years ago after the owner mysteriously disappeared. They say the place is cursed." My blood ran cold. I'd been to a place that didn't exist, or that once existed. I took out my wallet to check the money. The $20 bill I had given the old man was gone. In its place was a $20 bill, yes, but it was an old bill from a series that had stopped circulating in the 70s. I never took that exit again, and every time I see a gas station sign on a lonely road, a part of me dreads running into that ghost station and its silent attendant again, trapped in a time that is no longer ours. Eyes on the brake, how are you? I'm Miguel, and although I now work more in logistics from an office, there was a time, about 15 years ago to be exact, when the cab of my trailer was my second home. The highways of the United States were my personal map, and believe me, there are places where night is more than darkness. This happened to me on a trip I was taking on Highway 40 through New Mexico. It was one of those clear nights with a sky full of stars, like you only see in the desert. I'd been driving for hours, my eyelids were feeling heavy, and I decided to pull into a rest area for a nap. It wasn't one of the largest or best, but there were a couple of other trucks parked there, which always gives a certain feeling of security. I turned off the engine, closed the cab curtains, and settled into the bunk. I was so tired that I fell asleep almost instantly, but it wasn't restful sleep. I woke with a start, feeling like someone was watching me. My heart was pounding. Everything was silent, only the distant murmur of the road could be heard. I tried to calm myself by telling myself it was just the suggestion, the stress of the trip. I tossed and turned in my bunk, trying to go back to sleep. Then I heard it, a soft scratching just outside my door, more insistent. Someone or something was scratching at the paint on my truck. I jolted upright, fear tightening my throat. I held my breath, listening closely. Silence. Maybe an animal. I thought a coyote, a stray dog. I was about to go back to bed when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. In the small gap between the windshield curtains, a shadow moved outside. Then 2 bright dots, like eyes, reflected the scant moonlight. They were low and at window height, too large to be a common animal. I froze. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The eyes were still fixed there, staring into my cabin. They were a sickly yellow and seemed to possess a malicious intelligence. I could feel their gaze piercing through the curtains as if they knew I was there. Awake and terrified, minutes that seemed like hours passed. The eyes didn't move. They just stared. A cold sweat ran down my back. My mind searched for a logical explanation, a joker, some homeless person, but the intensity of that gaze, the unnatural stillness of the figure those eyes belonged to, told me it wasn't human at all. Suddenly, the eyes moved, slowly ascending the window, as if the creature were rearing up. Then, a sharp tap on the glass, right at the level of my head. I let out a strangled scream. The eyes disappeared. I waited, trembling, for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, with my heart in my mouth, I dared to part the curtains slightly. There was nothing, just the quiet night and the other parked trucks. The rest area seemed asleep, oblivious to my terror. I couldn't sleep another wink. At first light, I started the truck and sped off. When I stopped for breakfast, with the sun already high in the air, I checked the door. It had 3 long scratches in the paint, as deep as if made by enormous claws. I never knew what stalked me that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, overexerted by tiredness, but the scratches on my truck were real. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still feel that yellow stare upon me, watching me from some unseen corner. Since then, I choose, where I spend the night much more carefully, and I always leave a small light on. The frequency of fear. Good evening. My name is Arturo Valdivia. I was a passenger bus driver for many years, mainly on night routes through the Mexican wilderness. One gets used to the solitude of the early morning, the constant hum of the engine, and the stories of the passengers. But there's one night that stands out, one where the bus radio became a window to something otherworldly. I was traveling from Querétaro to San Luis Potosí. It was a pitch-black night, moonless, and the highway stretched out like a black ribbon in front of me. I had few passengers, most of them asleep. To stay awake, I would listen to the radio, searching for a station, playing ranchera music or talk shows. That night, the signal was terrible. All I could get was static and fragments of distant transmissions. I was fiddling with the dial when suddenly a clear, crisp voice emerged from the speakers. It wasn't music or a familiar program. It was a man's voice speaking in a monotone, almost hypnotic tone. "Are you tired, Arturo?" the voice said. "You've been driving for many hours. Pull over, rest." My blood ran cold. How did he know my name? I looked at the passengers in the rearview mirror. They were all asleep. No one was near the cockpit microphone. I thought maybe it was a local station, one of those midnight programs that interact with truckers or drivers, but the tone was too personal, too intimate. "We know you miss your daughter, Arturo," the voice continued, now with a hint of sadness. "She misses you too. She's here waiting for you. My daughter had died 2 years ago in an accident." A sharp pain shot through my chest. Who the hell was playing with me in such a cruel way? I grabbed the bus radio microphone. "Who's speaking?" "This isn't funny," I yelled. My voice trembled with anger and confusion. The only response was a soft, chilling laugh that seemed to fill the entire cabin. Then, a sweet, familiar little girl's voice, so like my little Sophia's. "Daddy, come with me, Daddy. There's no pain here. We can play here forever." Tears blurred my eyes. It was impossible. Sophia was gone, but the voice was so real, so full of my daughter's innocence. A part of me, the most desperate and hurt, wanted to believe it. I wanted to stop the bus and look for her. "Don't believe them, Arturo." The man's voice intervened again. "They're just echoes of what you most desire. But we can make it real. All you have to do is turn the wheel, one small turn, and you'll be with her forever." I looked at the road. A dark ravine yawned to my right. The suggestion was powerful. For a moment, the idea of ending it all, of reuniting with my daughter, seemed tempting. It was the cry of a baby in the back of the bus that brought me back to reality. One of the passengers, a young mother, had woken up and was trying to calm her son. Life, responsibility, I had people in my care. Screaming with rage, I turned off the radio. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the voices. But I gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and kept driving. When we arrived in San Luis Potosí, the sun was just beginning to rise. I was exhausted, trembling, but alive. I never knew what it was, a hallucination from exhaustion and pain, a strange interference, or something more sinister, an entity that feeds on the desperation of night travelers. From that night on, I drove that route many more times, but I never turned on the radio again after midnight. There are frequencies it's better not to tune into, voices it's better not to listen to, and there are pains that, no matter how deep, should not guide us into darkness. The toll of Solsim going to tell you a story that happened to me a while ago, when I was still a newbie in the trucking world. My name is Samuel Herrera, and this experience marked me for life, making me respect certain stretches of road that seem forgotten by God and man. It happened on a secondary highway in the state of Veracruz, one of those that wind through sugarcane, fields and ghost towns. It was my first long trip. I was carrying a load of fertilizer to a remote farming community. The company gave me a map with a route that supposedly cut the distance but involved passing through a less trafficked area, especially at night. It was already late. The darkness was almost complete, interrupted only by my truck's headlights, cutting through the fog that was beginning to rise from the fields. According to the map, I was supposed to find a toll booth. I found it strange since it was an old state highway, not a toll road, but the signs were clear. After a couple of hours of driving through the monotony of the sugarcane fields, I spotted some dim lights in the distance. As I got closer, I saw the structure of an old toll booth with a rickety wooden barrier. It looked abandoned, but there was a dim light in the small cabin. I slowed down. A figure emerged from the cabin. It was a man, or what appeared to be one. He was hunched over, wearing a worn uniform and a cap that shadowed his face. I couldn't make out his features. He approached my window with exasperating slowness. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound confident. "How much is the toll?" The man didn't answer. He just held out a bony hand, palm up. His skin was greyish, almost translucent in the light from my cab. A musty, earthy smell hung in the air. I felt a chill. I searched my wallet for some coins and small bills. I didn't know how much he would charge. "We don't have much cash," a voice said, but it wasn't the man's. It sounded like a collective whisper, as if many people were speaking very quietly at once. I looked at the man, but his lips didn't move. "Who said that?" I asked, fear beginning to grip me, my hand still outstretched. I decided to give him a medium denomination bill, hoping it would be enough. As I touched his hand to hand him the money, I felt a chill as if I were touching a corpse. The man took the bill with claw-like fingers and slowly retreated toward the booth. The wooden barrier didn't rise. I waited a moment. The engine of my truck rumbled in the stillness of the night. The man didn't return. I honked the horn. Nothing. I was getting nervous. What kind of place was this? Then the whispers became clearer. "This time it's not enough. They always ask for more. We need more to cross." I looked around. The fog had thickened, and through it I thought I saw blurry figures, shadows moving through the sugarcane fields, slowly approaching the truck. There were many, too many. Panic gripped me. I put it in reverse, but the truck didn't move, as if it was stuck. The shadows were closer. I could make out human shapes, but distorted, some incomplete. Their eyes seemed to glow in the dark. I slammed the accelerator forward, intending to break through the barrier. The old engine roared. The wooden barrier split with a sharp crack. I accelerated without looking back, my heart pounding. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figures approaching the toll booth, surrounding it, and the man in the cap, who was now standing in the middle of the road, looking at me, or rather, looking through me. I drove like crazy until I reached the next town. Almost at dawn, I stopped at a diner, shivering, and told the owner what had happened to me. The man, an old man from the area, listened attentively. When I finished, he sighed. "Son," he said, "that toll booth was closed over 40 years ago. There was a terrible accident there. A bus full of people crashed. They say the conductor went crazy, that he kept charging the dead, and that the souls of those who couldn't pay their fare to the afterlife are still trapped there, looking for a way across. I never again used unknown routes to take shortcuts, and every time I pass near a lonely place and smell the damp earth, I speed up because I know there are tolls that aren't paid with money, but with something much more valuable, the town that slept to much best regards. My name is Ernesto Padilla, and although I've already hung up the keys to my trailer, the roads of Mexico live on in my memories. Some are funny anecdotes, others are lessons learned, and then there's what I experienced near a small town in the mountains of Oaxaca, a place that didn't appear on any modern map and that seemed to be governed by its own strange rules. I had strayed from my main route due to a landslide on the road. Directions from locals led me along a dirt road that promised to reconnect me with civilization in a few hours. The sun was beginning to set when I spotted a small hamlet in a hidden valley, adobe houses, a church with a half-collapsed bell tower, and a deathly silence. The place was called, according to a worn-out sign, the entrance to deep sleep. I needed water and maybe something to eat, so I decided to stop. I parked the truck on the outskirts and walked toward what appeared to be the main square. It was an eerily quiet town. There were no children playing, no dogs barking, nor the murmur of conversations one expects in such a place. The doors and windows of the houses were closed, but not padlocked, just ajar. On a bench in the plaza, I saw an old woman sitting motionless with a shawl covering her head. I approached cautiously. "Good afternoon, Grandma," I said. "Do you know where I can get some water?" The old woman didn't move. I thought maybe she was deaf or asleep. I moved a little closer. Her skin was pale, almost cerulean, and her eyes were open, fixed on an invisible point, unblinking. A chill ran through me. She wasn't asleep, nor did she seem alive. I stepped back, a sense of alarm growing inside me. I looked around at the porch of a nearby house. A man sat motionless in a rocking chair, his head tilted to one side and his eyes glassy. A woman lay beside a well, as if she'd collapsed while drawing water. Everyone was in the same unnaturally still position, with that same pallor. The entire village seemed to be plunged into a sleep from which they could not awaken, or worse, as if they were mannequins arranged in a macabre representation of everyday life. The air was heavy, laden with a sweet smell, like overripe flowers on the verge of rot. I ran back to the truck, panic taking hold. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I started the engine, and as I maneuvered around the corner, my headlights illuminated the inside of one of the houses through an uncurtained window. Inside, an entire family sat around a table with food laid out, all in the same catatonic position, their eyes wide open and blank. I managed to speed out of town, not daring to look back. I drove for hours until I found a federal police patrol car. I excitedly told them what I had seen. The officers looked at each other skeptically but agreed to accompany me, more out of protocol than because they believed me. When we reached the turnoff leading to the valley again, the road seemed different, more enclosed by vegetation. And when we reached the place where the town should have been, there was nothing, just hills, trees, and the silence of the mountains. No sign of the houses, the church, or the sign for deep sleep. It was as if the town had vanished, or as if it had never existed. The police looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They asked me questions, hinting that perhaps fatigue had played tricks on me. I knew what I had seen. The images of those motionless people with their empty eyes remained etched in my mind. I never found an explanation. Was it a hallucination? A ghost town that only appears to certain travelers? I only know that sometimes, in the silence of the night, I wonder about the people in deep sleep. If they ever woke up, or if they're still there in their hidden valley, trapped in that eternal, macabre stillness. I'm grateful I didn't stay to find out. The shadow in the cabin, how are you all? I'm Francisco Pancho to all of you behind the wheel. I've driven almost every road in this country, the United States, from coast to coast, from border to border, for over 25 years. You see a lot of things. You face loneliness, fatigue, and sometimes things that have no logical explanation, like what happened to me one night at a truck stop somewhere in Nebraska. It was one of those cold, windy nights where the whistling air seems to bring wailing sounds with it. I was exhausted after almost 14 hours behind the wheel. I parked in the back row of the rest area, looking for some peace and quiet to sleep for a few hours in the cabin of my Peterbilt. I ate something quickly, checked the door locks, and got into my bunk. I fell asleep quickly, but my sleep was restless, filled with confusing images. I woke up with a sudden feeling of tightness in my chest. The cabin was dark. Only the faint moonlight filtered through a gap in the curtain. Everything seemed normal, but I felt a presence. An unnatural chill had invaded the small space, even though the heater was on. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the wind outside. It must have been a nightmare, I told myself, trying to calm down. I was about to close my eyes again when I saw it. In the darkest corner of the cabin, near my feet, there was a shadow. It wasn't a shadow cast by some object. It was denser, darker than darkness itself. It had a vaguely human shape, but it was hunched over, as if curled up at first. I thought my eyes were deceiving me, that it was just sleep and the darkness, but the shadow moved. Slowly, it straightened slightly, as if becoming aware of my presence. It had no face or visible eyes, but I could feel it watching me. A cold, primordial terror coursed through me from head to toe. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was frozen, like in those nightmares where you try to run and can't. The shadow extended something that looked like an arm, a long, thin limb that stretched toward me. A fetid smell, like rusted metal and rotting flesh, filled the cabin. I could feel the temperature dropping even further as it got closer. I tried to back away, to press myself closer to the cabin wall, but there was no escape. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the worst, silently praying every prayer I knew. A few seconds passed that felt like an eternity. When I dared to open my eyes again, the shadow was still closer. Its hand was 100 centimeters from my face. I could feel a kind of suction, as if it were trying to suck my breath, my soul, out of me. In a burst of desperation, I groped around in the darkness, searching for something, anything. My fingers found the metal flashlight I always kept by my bunk. Without thinking, I turned it on and pointed the light directly at the shadow. There was a sound, a guttural hiss, like air escaping from rotten lungs, and the shadow recoiled violently, as if the light were burning it. It shrank in on itself, and for an instant, before vanishing completely, I thought I saw two bright red dots where its face had been. Then it was gone. The nauseating smell lingered for a few more minutes. The cab was still freezing, I was shaking like a leaf. I jumped out of the bunk, turned on all the interior lights, and checked every corner. There was nothing there, just me and my terror. I couldn't sleep again that night. As soon as dawn broke, I started the truck and left that stop like a soul carried by the devil. I never knew what that thing was, a product of my extreme tiredness, an evil spirit that haunts lonely stops. I don't know. But since then, I always sleep with a light on and my flashlight within reach. And every time I enter the cabin in the dark, a part of me fears finding that shadow lurking in the corner.